Awesome. All right. Well, this is our first foray or an experiment into using Open Broadcast Studio to record some video of a pair programming session between myself and Dave Ginn. We are going to attempt today to demonstrate how to publish a React client web app to a static web app in Azure. So hopefully this turns out to be a successful experiment. And if that is the case, then we'd love to start bringing you some more content on a weekly basis where we stream that live to our Microsoft Azure Health and Life Sciences YouTube channel. So how does that sound, Dave?
That sounds awesome. Thanks for having me today, Phil. And static web apps are something that's new to me, even though I've done a lot of React development over the years. So I'm really looking forward to this session and learning from you here.
Yeah, awesome. I know I've been playing around a little bit lately with like how to publish a static web app, how to publish a Blazor app, like a Blazor WebAssembly app out to static web apps. And we do have some samples of that in our team repos on GitHub that we could maybe show off in a future session. That might be kind of cool. But basically any type of client app or a spa that you want to host that even can have a certain amount of, if you have like an Express backend API to it and so forth, that can be hosted using static web apps with an API backend using Azure Functions, which is really cool. So we've got some other video content we could share around that. But I think for today, let's just try to get this sample app. You've been working on a React client app that demonstrates how to fetch some
hmm
patient data and physician data from our Graphfire project, which is a GraphQL interface in front of the Azure API for Fire.
Yep.
So I think it's a good demo of how easy it is to create a client app, and maybe we can show off then today how to get that hosted quickly in an Azure static web app. So I'm going to
Sounds
switch over
good.
here to our Azure portal, and let's just go ahead and create a new resource group. I kind of like to start here in the portal so we can see what the bits and pieces are. And as we'll see in a minute, there's a ton of tooling that's now built into the Azure portal around like app service and static web apps that helps you get like CI/CD pipelines spun up as you're deploying resources, so that it doesn't turn into that just right-click deploy type scenario where you spin everything up in Azure and then all of a sudden you find yourself just like dragging and dropping zip files to publish or using FTP to publish. We'll see how it's going to use some wizards to create YAML pipelines that we can then use in Azure DevOps or GitHub Action Workflows to create the whole process for us. So that being said, let's go ahead and get this new resource group created.
Cool. And while you're
Um,
doing that, what are we going to use for CI/CD today? I know I've got a pretty deep background in Azure DevOps, but I've not touched
sure.
GitHub Actions much. I noticed you mentioned both of those with our
Yep.
YAML file.
Yeah, and even further than that, we'll see how templates can be generated that would be more portable too, right? So
Okay.
even if you're using like a system, what's another good one, like Jenkins or some other
Okay.
CI/CD system, the Azure portal is now able to generate those templates for us that we could use them in whatever system we wanted to.
Oh,
I was
awesome.
just kind of giving the example of DevOps and GitHub, since those are kind of natively integrated and can be wired up for us. We'll go with GitHub Actions though, since the repo that you've been working on is already in GitHub. Then we can just kind of deploy that pipeline template right alongside of that YAML file right alongside in your repo, and the portal will do that for us. So we'll see how
Awesome.
that works in just a second. I guess East US is an okay region. We're just creating a new resource group here. Finish creating that. And then scrolling
Looks
through
like
to
it's been
find what we
created.
called it. Yeah, I believe I called it Graphfire React.
Yep.
There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new static web app. All right, there we've got one right there. All right, and let's just go through the options here. It's going to be in our HLS hack subscription where we just created this resource group, so that's all pre-selected, which is nice. We can just give it a name. This works a little bit differently than, if you're familiar with spinning up Azure App Service, where you have to come up with a name that's globally unique across like all of Azure. You don't need to do that here. What ends up happening is in the background, a dynamically generated URL and a public facing IP gets spun up for the static web app.
Oh, cool.
And then, obviously if you need to add like a custom domain or, your own SSL cert and everything in there, you can do that, but it's going to generate a name for us. So that way, when we're giving the resource itself a name here, we don't need to, come up with something that's like totally unique or whatever. So we'll just call it like our Graphfire React client.
Perfect. That'll match the GitHub repo name.
Awesome. Okay, that's great. Um, there's two different plan types or SKUs available right now with static web apps. Free, you are kind of limited, I believe, in how many free instances you can have in a particular subscription. But free means free, right? And it says for hobby or personal projects, we want you to use this, we want you to try it out, host some websites, and it's totally free. You are a little bit limited there, again, in the number of sites that you can deploy using that free SKU, and then also in some of the capabilities, like some of the more advanced capabilities, if you want to, do things with like VNets, or if you have some like kind of network special cases that you want to handle with restricting traffic, or if you want to do something called bring your own API backend. So like if you wanted to integrate with an API that already exists someplace else in another subscription, you wouldn't be able to do that with the free SKU. You'd have to
Got it.
upgrade to the standard SKU. But for us today, since we're just trying to get a React pretty simple app up and running, we can use the free one, which is fine. We'll pick East, I guess East US, where our resource group default was selected, isn't available for static web apps right now, but we can pick East US 2, that's close enough.
Okay.
For the default integration with source control, we'll say we want to use GitHub, and you can see that it's already detected that I'm signed in to my GitHub account. I could choose to change that if I wanted to. And then it shows me a list of the repos and organizations that I have access to. So this is the wizard I talked about that will wire up the CI/CD pipeline for us in our repo
Cool.
automatically, depending on which one we choose.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, cool. So, the repo that you have with your code is in the Microsoft organization, which kind of unfortunately for us, like that's a pretty large organization, right? There's a lot of repos in there. So usually what happens is when you select Microsoft, and maybe this is fixed now. Let's see what happens here. But sometimes if you pick a very large organization, it has to kind of iterate through all of those repositories. And it may just time out. So if you pick that and you see like this is just empty, that could be a reason.
Okay.
We called this Graphfire React
Client.
client.
Yep.
And again, I don't think it's like lifetime searching right there. I think it just realized like, hey, this is a really big org. We're not going to be able to pull back all the repos. So there's
Okay.
just none in the list. So not a big deal. One way to get around that is just pick like your personal org if you want to, and then just pick like a placeholder, just create like an empty project or something so that we can get the template generated.
Got it.
Or you can just come up here and say other, and then what'll happen is it'll show us the template at the end that it was going to use, and then we can just upload that manually. So I think that's the route we'll have to go today here.
All right.
All right, let me just make sure that's what I want to do. We'll just pretend we're going to use one of these. You have a main branch, I think, in yours, right?
I do. Yes.
All right. So, and this, I kind of wanted to complete the wizard here too, so you can see some of the other options that it gives you. You need to pick the branch, which represents the main branch, so it'll set up our GitHub action workflow pipeline so that it only triggers a release when a change is made to this main branch. So, that way you can kind of set up your Git flow processes if you want to. And then down here under build presets, we've got a whole list of frameworks to choose from. So, if you had a Blazor app, like that's an option now. You can just pick from Blazor and it's right there. Since we have React, we can just choose React. It'll ask us like, hey, where's the root of your application? And I believe we can select just the root of it here.
Okay.
Let me double check though what the structure of yours looks like. So when yours gets built, I believe it goes into the public folder, right? Like that's where the site is hosted out of?
Yes, when you're running it locally, but I think there's also a build command that outputs a build folder.
Okay. So we would want to, either configure it then to point at this public folder or figure out like when you build it, where is it gonna go? And
So
that's gonna be like the home directory if that we want
yeah, if we
for
want
the
to test
app.
that really quick, I don't know if you have Visual Studio Code open and can open this repository really quick, but you can run a npm or yarn build
Yeah,
and
let's
it'll do that production build. And I just did
let's
that
give it a
locally and
whirl here.
it output a build folder for this.
So let's see what that looks like, and that can give us some clues for the configuration questions that
Yep.
we're being asked about.
Yeah,
Let's just,
and just for everyone's information, this React project was bootstrapped using Create React App, which I think is one of the common ways to do it, but definitely not the only way to
cool.
bootstrap a
Okay,
React.
so you're saying I should be able to do like a yarn build?
Yep, you should be able to
And,
just run yarn build, and
okay,
that's going to run the React scripts build from the package.json file. And what you're going to see is it's going to output a build folder to the root directory.
all right, awesome. Yeah, I see that there now. Okay, so let's hop back over to my browser and look at this configuration. So output location, yeah, so the app itself is located at the root of our repo.
Yep.
And then the output location, like you said, when I ran the yarn build there, it goes to this build folder. So it looks like they kind of picked up on that as a standard or a best practice with React apps and pre-populated that for me, which is pretty cool.
Awesome.
All right, so let's see if I can get this to.
So, question for you: could you
Yeah,
potentially then, since the Microsoft organization's having trouble loading, could you potentially go fork that GitHub repo that we have into your own organization,
yes, yep, I could. Why
and then
don't
that
why
could
don't
be
we do
one we
that
work off?
before we? Yep, that's okay. All right, cool. So let's do that, and then we'll come back and create it again. So I will switch from here. Let's see, I can just use the fork button right over here. That's a great idea. So we'll just fork that right into my personal GitHub. Fork the main branch, that's okay. All right, awesome. So now I'm in my personal one, and if I go back to the Azure portal this time, and we say we want to create a static web app. All right, so Graphire React, there it is. Graphire React client is what we want to call it. Okay, these are options from before. Again, we'll move it to East US 2. And now we should be able to just pick from my list here. And let's see, do we see it on the list yet?
There it
Graphire
is.
React Client, perfect. Good thinking. All right, and we'll choose our React app again. The defaults are fine. Now we should be able to review and create it.
Awesome.
All right, we'll set that deployment in motion. Okay, so this is just in Azure portal deploying the static web app.
Okay.
Behind the scenes now, what's happening is because we chose the GitHub repo and the type of app that it was and everything, it's going to reach out because I was signed into my GitHub account. It's going to reach out to that repository and place a YAML file, a build or a GitHub action workflow file out there for us that knows how to deploy the app into this static web app.
Oh, cool. Does it do that as a pull request then that we're
Yeah,
able to
let's go check it
review?
out. So if I go here, and I might have to refresh, we'll just see what we got. So it did it as me, and you can see it is running already.
Oh, cool.
The action runs right away. But if I look at the history of commits, you should see that, you know, because I was signed into my GitHub account on the Azure portal, it was able to create this commit as me, and this is what it did. It did CI add Azure Static Web Apps workflow file. And so here's what the file looks like. I'll actually pull this up in just the plain viewer. So under your GitHub workflows folder, you get a new YAML file. And so here's our GitHub action workflow. So this first section refers to the triggers, or what is going to kick off this action to run. So anytime there is a push of code to the branch main, it's going to trigger this. And then also, this is kind of a cool feature of static web apps is there's like a separate, what do you call it? Like similar to Azure App Service, where you have the different like deployment slots.
Oh, okay.
So kind of a concept like that, where on a pull request, it will deploy like a dev or a staged instance of the app that will be, it'll display the URL of that temporary location or that staged app. So you have an opportunity to test it on a pull request before it actually gets merged into your main branch and gets deployed out to the production slot in the static web app. So that's kind of a cool feature there as well.
Hey, very cool. Hey, Phil, just as a kind of a side topic, while we're looking at this code in GitHub in the browser, would you mind changing your URL to github.dev instead of github.com, and we can show our users some of the
Yeah.
cool new GitHub features
Yeah.
really quick?
I haven't used that much myself,
You can
but
also, I've got it to work before where you just hit period in the browser, which is super cool. It'll load up
yeah.
the same experience, but effectively what we're going to get here is
So we get an
VS Code
in-browser editor of the files. Yep.
in the dev. Yep.
Yeah, I love
Or
it.
VS Code in the browser. So super neat.
Very cool. So is this run by GitHub then? Or is it going
Yes.
to like an alternate uh, like hosting provider or something that like just knows how to read the files?
This is run by GitHub. I
It
believe this is
is.
a feature
Cool.
that was shipped by GitHub, as far as I
Nice.
know. Yep.
Yeah, I like that. Another thing I love too is if you have like GitHub code spaces enabled, super helpful, like especially if you want to be able to run it and debug it without having to install a bunch of dependencies on your own
Yep.
machine. That's another
Agreed.
great option too, to open up the repo just right in the browser using a code space. Cool, yeah, this is great. So now we can see all the files right here in the Solution Explorer in VS Code. You may notice that even though I'm running VS Code here in my browser, it's picked up on the fact that like I want my menu navigation over here on the right. Normally that's on the left. So that's a setting that I've created for myself. And even though I'm running in the browser, it's able to like synchronize all those settings and present VS Code, with the way I want to see it or the settings that
Yep.
I've pre-configured. So that's pretty cool.
So can we talk through this build file
Yeah,
for a
let's
second, or
do
this
it.
YAML file for a
Yep.
second? Because one of the things I was curious about, and maybe you can answer this question for me, is when we check in the code to this repository, that build folder is get ignored. So it's not going to be there until we run that like yarn
Nope.
build
So
command like we
that's an
did.
incorrect statement. So the underscore GitHub/workflows folder is not get ignored. And
No,
this
sorry.
definitely will
No,
show up.
I meant the build folder where we ran yarn build a
Oh,
few minutes
sure.
ago.
Yeah.
So that
Okay.
folder is get ignored. So is this going to run that command for us to generate that folder as part of the build pipeline process?
So with again, I haven't done this a ton with React apps, so we're just kind of playing around with this today
Okay.
and figuring it out. Like in the example of Blazor, where it's a C# application that's being compiled, it does, this build and deploy step will actually, build like the C# assemblies and everything for Blazor, and then they'll be made available.
Cool.
My understanding though is that yes, the build and deploy job here, which is the first thing that's going to happen, or I guess that's the main job of the action workflow here, it will, based on the fact that we told it it's a React app, it should, you know, do the install and run that for us.
That's
So
awesome. I mean, I
yeah.
guess it's already run, so let's see if it worked.
I think in some cases though, like if it doesn't do that, then what you have to do is like right here, this is an instance on line 21 of a step, within the job. You can see there's kind of a list of steps.
Yep.
It's kind of confusing sometimes because, some of them have a name specified, but like this first one doesn't say the name of the step you're running, just which
Oh, sure.
action it's going to run. So sometimes it looks a little goofy with the list of steps there. But my point being, we could, if we discover, oh, for some reason we've got some goofy new, framework, or maybe we want to use like hot towel or something, and there's not
Yep.
like a out of the box build, or the build isn't working for whatever reason, we can add another step in between here that runs the build on this workflow runner in GitHub as it's running this action workflow. And then that would be, output that's available for when it gets to this next build and deploy
Mm,
step, so that it could use
got it.
that to publish the app. So I guess we'll find out in just a second here how much of that is kind of wired up for us, or if we need to add that intermediate step. So pretty simple, just two steps. It's checking out your repo to the runner,
Okay.
and then it's trying to run this Azure Static Web Apps deploy action, which takes in, basically all of those configuration questions we saw in the Azure portal in that wizard, such as, the app location, it's just in the root of the repo, the output build location, it's in the build folder, and we don't have an API that we're using, so we can just leave that blank.
Awesome.
Down here then on line 35, this is the job that runs on, like I said, this gets triggered two different ways, where either on a merge into the main branch, it will run and do the build and deploy, but also it will run on a pull request where it would publish it to that like staging slot, or kind of the temporary test slot in the static web app. So they include this job here starting on line 35, so that when the PR is closed, it kind of closes that all out and cleans it up for you, closes the PR.
Got it.
Cool. So let's go back to, let's see if I
You want to
just,
go look and see what if that ran
yeah, so if I look
successfully?
under actions right here, this will show me a list of all the running actions. And like I said, when this commit happened, that action was there and it ran right away because it was available immediately. And it looks like it's green, so it thinks it's deployed to our static web app.
Okay.
So let's, you can click in and get the details on that. It ran the build and deploy job, which again was kind of the only job that it needs to do. You can further drill in and see here all the steps that happened.
Can we expand that second one just out of curiosity? Or yeah, that
Yeah,
one right there, the build and deploy.
yep. This is also something kind of neat that the GitHub Action Workflow runners will do. And I keep using the term runners. If you're familiar with Azure DevOps, you've
Hmm.
got they're not runners,
Agents.
they're the agents. Yes, so
Okay.
that's the apples to apples kind of comparison there. It's the same thing as agents in Azure DevOps.
Got it. Can we look at maybe the logging for that build and deploy step a little bit just to kind of see
Yeah, so
what
let's
happened?
check it out. So here we can see it is starting to run the deploy.
Okay.
Let's see, it gave it an ID. It found the root directory. It uses this special build agent in static web apps called Orinx. I don't know a ton about that, but it's kind of a cool little utility, is my understanding, that's able to like natively understand and be able to build like multiple different types of static web app framework
Okay.
apps. All right, so let's see what it did here. Detecting platform. It detected
Node.js, it looks like.
Node.js.
Yep.
So it's going to say, okay, we need to use Node.js. All right, we got some warnings down here. So let's see, resolving packages,
Oh, hey,
linking
it ran our build
dependencies,
command, line 73.
building fresh packages, and then right here, yarn build. Cool. So creating an optimized production build, that sounds like what we want. We've got some JS bundles here then that were the result, which I think is also what we wanted to see.
Yep, those live out in a static app directory. That's part of what gets deployed. So that's
Yep.
great to see.
So that does take a little while to run. I mean, 1 minute isn't like an eternity, but when you're talking about running builds, especially for just a simple, basically hello world app,
Hmm.
this can take a little while to run. So just be advised of that, I guess. You may see several minutes even, like with Blazor apps, I know specifically, those will sometimes take like almost 5 minutes to
Oh, wow.
build
Okay.
those. And
So be
again, I
patient.
think it comes down to like that Oryx agent, just because it's kind of like a, one ring to rule them all, kind of a tool that can understand all these different frameworks. So depending on your framework, like your mileage may vary on how
Sure.
long the build takes there. But it looks like the build was completed, and then here's where it's going to deploy it. Um, again, this looks like kind of an error here, but I think that's expected. We didn't have an API or want one, so it's just telling us that that was empty, and then it does the work of uploading that to the static web app. So deployment was complete. And then it
Awesome.
does give us the URL here. And again, this is the generated URL for the app. So we could just click on that and go straight to it. Or if I go back over to the Azure portal and go to the resource, it will also tell us here on the overview page the generated URL of the app. So let's click on that and see it renders your app. So far, so good.
So,
Yep, and it looks like it was doing an automatic redirect for login there to Azure Active Directory. And it
yep.
did come back. You saw that kind of some URL jumping around was happening up here. So we did go over to Azure Active Directory. I'm already signed in, so it kicks me back
Hmm.
then to the redirect URL. And now my suspicion is, we haven't configured Active Directory to understand that, like, hey, this is an app you should trust now that it's published out in Azure. So, we just have to go update some settings now for our authentication flow so that this will complete the redirect back to our app
Yeah, and
successfully.
I think part of that issue too, if we were to go back and look at our GitHub repository too, we can show where we've got an opportunity to improve that project.
Cool.
Um, I can show this really quick if you don't mind pulling it up. And
Should I go back to the editor?
yeah, let's go back to the editor. That's great. I Yeah. So just add the
Yeah,
.dev to the
I don't
URL.
use that option as much as I should. That's pretty cool.
So if you look in our source directory and open up the authconfig.js,
Yep. Let's see, auth config right
since we had
there.
primarily been testing this locally, if you look at line 6, we've got a hard-coded redirect URL that we're passing over as part of that query string.
Got it. Okay.
So,
So if I just put in this URL right there instead
yep,
of what we had. Whoops, I need to get back to this other tab. There we go.
yep.
Typing, coding
And then we'll
on camera.
probably want to keep that on in our clipboard because I think we're going to need that someplace else as well. We're probably going to need to go back to the Azure AD app and specify that that's a valid redirect
Okay, cool.
URI. And then we'll also probably need to go to our API since this is since this is a JavaScript application and all of our API calls are being made through the client. We're going to have
Mm-hmm.
to make that a valid CORS origin.
Cool.
So a couple config settings that we
Yep.
need to
Yeah,
update to
good
get all
good
this to
call out.
work.
So let's see if we can
Yep.
just cruise through that really quick and maybe get it to work to
Yeah.
finish off the video. But again, if we look at, we're kind of making some code edits here,
Yep.
but if you look in this repo that we forked because I wanted to put it in
Hmm.
my personal GitHub so that we could easily access it, now we could take this file and put it back. I could do a PR and push this back to our main repo that you created in the Microsoft
Yep.
org. And now that would be wired up to publish to that same static web app that we just created.
Super
And if we
cool.
wanted to change that, the way that it works is GitHub uses secrets. So inside of the settings of your GitHub repo, this is another step that it did for us automatically as part of that wizard, is it was able to, using my sign-in credentials from Azure, go and provision some secret settings in our GitHub repository. So this is how it knows, this is like the publish profile, essentially, if you're familiar with app service,
Yep.
where to publish that to. So, we just have to copy this file, push it over to our other repo, update the secrets. You can even change the name if you want to, no big deal. And obviously you can get those secrets there from right here. So on your static web app, there's a button at the top from the
Oh,
overview
cool.
blade that says manage deployment token. You click on that, it'll show you all your secret values, pop those into your GitHub secrets or your Azure DevOps, environment variables, what have you. And then you're good to go. Then the action knows how to deploy to this resource.
Super cool.
All right, so what we want to do now, though, is find the Graphire project, which I believe is in another subscription. So I'll have to switch over to that really quick. I can never remember which subscription that's in, but I think it's in our internal sub. So I'll just
Okay.
switch to Microsoft, which is where we are. Ready, good. Let's see, I think it's just Graphire. There it is. So this is, in case you're confused on the video, we said, oh, there's no API involved in this app, and that's true, sort of, right? We're not publishing our own API. The client app itself is making client-side requests out to an existing API, and that's what this is. Again, this is our GraphQL wrapper in front of an Azure API for Fire. So what Dave mentioned is, we just have to go out here and make sure that we're allowing client-side calls to this API so that we can call
Okay.
it from our app,
Yep.
which I believe is just on the app service. And let's see, I could probably just search there for what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think if you
But
just
it's
search
so
for
much more
cores.
fun to, sit there and hunt for it. Okay. So I don't think I want that on there. That's interesting that it was there. And we'll save that.
So you're just going to set it up to allow from
Yeah, we'll
start.
just do that for now for the demo. No big deal, since
Sounds good.
presumably we'll want to be able to call this from other things.
And then we will need to go make that same change to the Azure Active Directory app to
Yeah,
make that a valid
exactly.
redirect.
And that'll be over here in my other tenant.
Yep, and check my client ID that I use there too, because that might be one that I created for my testing purposes.
Oops, that's right. I'm in the browser editor. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Let's go back to auth config
Yep.
and
So line 3
client
has the client ID. Yep.
ID. Yep. All right, we'll make sure that guy is set up.
And if for some reason you don't have access to that, I'm hanging out over here in my browser and I can make
Yeah,
you
should
an
be
owner
good. Here he is.
on that.
All right, so I
So,
think what we want to do is under authentication, we've got
yep.
our, just for testing locally when we run that, we've got the redirect in there, right? So we want to add a redirect, to the single page
Single page
application type,
applications.
yep.
Yep.
And hopefully I still have this in my clipboard. Yes, there it is.
And perfect. I think that should be.
And don't forget the save button there. Sometimes we hide those. All right, so application is updated. We've updated the cores. So now, presumably, we don't want to be going to localhost anymore. Let me just close this tab
Yeah. Do
and
we want to check to
we'll...
make sure that that redeployment ran?
Oh, you know what? I didn't do that yet. So this is still a pending change.
Yep.
In the browser editor, it auto-saved it for me, which is great, but I better go to my GitHub and add, what do I want to say, published URL. Redirect. Something like that. Okay, cool. So we
Cool.
can add all of our changes and we'll commit them. All
Cool.
right.
And since that was committed directly to the main
Yep.
branch,
Committed it
that'll
straight to
automatically
main,
trigger.
which, shame on me, but I'm, in my own fork, in my own repo, no
Yep.
problem. But yes, that committed directly to main. That'll trigger our workflow. Let me just pop another tab over here. Graphire React client, there it is. And if we go to actions, we've got one running. So again, this should take about a minute or so. And then that
Cool. And can
will,
we see the live logging on that while
yeah,
it's
let's
running?
check it
Does
out.
it let us do
Yep,
that?
yep.
Oh yeah.
And
So
this
we
is
can
kind of what
see
I was talking about
exactly what
earlier
stage it's
too.
in.
There's only like 2 steps in this job, but we get more than that, it seems like, usually in the logs. The GitHub Action workflow runners do a pretty decent job of like recognizing what their prerequisites are going to be. So there's usually a setup step that happens here where it'll kind of prepare like the permissions and fetch secrets and do different things. And then it also recognizes that we're going to do an Azure Static Web App deployment. And that action uses a container, a Docker container, to run and do
Oh,
its thing. So that's what this step is all about here. So this isn't where it's actually running the build and deploy job. It's just doing the setup for that action. So
okay.
sometimes you'll see that in your workflows, like kind of a bunch of steps at the beginning that are just doing like the setup or fetching all the prerequisites for the actions that will be run as part of the job.
Got it. And then down there on line 95 of that previous log, it looks like you can see
Oops.
exactly like the container that it's pulling,
Yep,
the container image that
exactly.
it's pulling. Cool.
Yeah. GitHub Actions are really fun because it's not like they're published any place that is super secret or hidden away. When you see an action step that says it's going to run Azure slash static web apps, deploy at v1, this is in the Azure organization on GitHub, and it's in a repo called static web apps deploy, and it's the tag v1.
Oh,
So
cool.
literally every GitHub action is just coming straight from a repository in GitHub.
This looks great. It looks like we're making good progress through here.
Finished uploading, so that's good.
So
I have things beeping at me in the background.
post deployment run. Looks like we finished. So now we can
Groovy.
probably go back to open a new tab and paste in our browser URL and see if everything works.
Yep, so let's go back here. Oh, cool, I got a link directly to our static web app and then our URL. All right, it's refreshing me. That went pretty quick. I think it's fetching data now. I can't remember exactly what we
It should
had
be
on the
fetching data
homepage
now.
here,
So do we
but
want to
yeah,
maybe do
it's
a look at the developer toolbar and make sure we don't have any errors
should
in here?
be
So again,
trying
since it's
to
the client side
fetch.
application.
Yep. I might have to refresh it again to get
Yeah,
this to go. Oh, hey, there
let's
it goes. Look at that.
there it goes. And we successfully got data back from the Graphire API. So that's great.
Groovy. Awesome. Yeah, and then, again, we mentioned it's just a simple demonstration app. So we've got a couple of different nav routes up here. Like I can click and get a list of patients, which looks like it didn't like us there. I know why this is, and it is something that happens with static web apps where you have to include a settings file if you're publishing an app to static web apps,
Ah,
um, so that static web apps knows how to handle routing, basically, right? So when we were at
yep.
the root URL here, it was like, oh, cool, I'll just load like the index file, which is our static web app. But inside of a static web app, when you have, like JavaScript defined routing going on, if I type that in here, the address bar, if I don't tell the static web app to expect that type of thing, it's going to go look for a physical file named that, and not be able to find what we're looking for. So
Got it. And
um,
that's really interesting to me that we have to do that. And great call out there. And
yeah,
from the React standpoint, the reason we're seeing our URLs look like that is we're using React Router for
yep,
our routing, and in particular, we're using the browser router, which puts things just as normal slashes. Alternatively, we could have used the hash router, which isn't as recommended these days, but that would have done a hashtag and then the route at the end of our URLs. And I would imagine if we had done that, we wouldn't have run into this issue.
Yep. All right, let's see if I can find the file that I am looking for. Let's see. I thought I had it in this one. Yep, here we go. So in the published folder, so I'm referencing one of my Blazor static web apps
Sure.
now just to see what the setup of that looks like. So this would be pretty similar, right? Like we've got that public folder in our React app, so that's think of that as like what this www root folder is in our Blazor WebAssembly app. So we need this file. Like, there's basically a configuration file that you can stick in there, and then that, the static web app is designed to pick up on the fact that the file exists and then use that for some of its configuration settings. So this is what we need to include. I could probably just download this file and save it over there. But the setting is called navigation fallback. So essentially, if you get to like a 404 in a static web app, you're saying, hey, just try to head back to the index.html page and let the static web app or the single page web application handle that route for you.
Got it.
Yeah, so let's see if we can just copy all of that. Static web app config JSON. Should be able to just pop a new file in here. We're going to put that in our public folder though. Okay.
And it has to have that specific name, I'm
Yes.
guessing? Okay.
Yep.
And we just paste the content into there and again do another commit, and that should force us to redeploy.
And I don't need those comments in there, that's fine. All right. Add a navigation fallback. Cool. All right, hopefully that's what we want. Yep, static web app config JSON. Perfect.
While we're waiting on that deployment, would it be possible, and this is just for my curiosity, to go over to Azure and look at that static web app and be able to like browse its file structure through like the advanced tools? Is that
I don't believe you get that here.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it is kind of a unique animal. There are some other interesting features we could maybe browse through though while we're waiting.
Yeah, let's do that.
Just standard configuration stuff. So if you wanted to put like app settings for some reason in there, and you can see here how we've got those different environments I was talking about. So similar to like deployment slots or whatever. You've got production, you can set up staging, you can set up, dev, whatever you need to do, and have a different set of configuration values for each one. Let's see, general settings. What do we got here? Visitor password. Yeah, whether or not you want staging environments turned on.
Oh, cool. It looks like
here's a little reference to like that static web app config file that we're using now to set configuration. App insights, we can wire that up, so that's pretty nice if you want to start collecting some client-side metrics and so forth using app insights. You can wire that up here.
Cool, and you had mentioned custom domains before,
yep,
so that looks like we can do that here.
Exactly, adding in any custom domains. APIs, so this we can maybe do in a subsequent video, but I mentioned if you did have like an Express backend or something for your spa, or maybe some other like simple API that you're using as kind of your server side, but you didn't want to go through the hassle of publishing the whole thing to a app service. Static Web Apps has the capability to publish that backend API for you as an Azure function. So this is kind of the area where you can see the configuration of all that.
Very cool.
Yeah. Let's see, did we talk about, yeah, different environments again? The preview deployments, this is what's happening when you do a PR against that branch. Like I said,
Okay.
that's kind of what's built into that thing. You'll see a preview deployment out here, which gets its own unique generated URL, not the main one. So you've got a separate site that you can browse to and test everything out before it gets rolled to production. So that's pretty neat. And there is some security stuff built in too, which is really cool. You can, through the configuration, uh, I mean, we're kind of diving into a whole bunch of additional topics now, I guess.
Right.
But if you're familiar with, I think it used to be called like Easy Auth, right? But like Azure AD
Yep.
authentication for like app service, all of those providers are turned on by default in a static web app.
Oh, cool.
Um, and you can kind of control the behavior of how you want them to work, or which ones you want to leverage using different configuration values in that static web app config that we saw earlier.
So
So
very
that's
cool.
a
So
whole
we
other
we
topic too. Go ahead.
yeah. So we spent a lot of time in our React app getting the
Like the
Azure AD
MSAL
auth
wired up.
and
Yeah.
MSAL all wired up. So
Hmm.
this would maybe, depending on the use case of the app, maybe make that process a little bit
Yep.
more straightforward.
Yeah, and as you just mentioned, we went ahead and wired all that up in the app itself, which was pretty straightforward to do. It's a pretty simple scenario. But if you did want to leverage other forms of authentication, so like the Facebook and the like GitHub auth provider, like literally every single one of them that comes natively out of the box with Easy Auth is turned on for a static web app. So like, let's say you were supporting multiple providers, then you could just put some code into your client-side app that, handles the authenticated user and not necessarily the wiring up of the
Oh, okay.
authentication mechanism. So you have that ability too, right, to like tap into the authentication provider that's happening in the static web app here, and then like get the context of the user and make decisions and stuff in your code.
So really, from an app standpoint, then it sounds like you could almost assume that your user's already logged in by the time
Right.
they're hitting your application,
Yep.
and then just do things contextually based on that
Exactly.
user. Very cool.
All right, let's
I
go
bet our
double
deployment's
check
almost
here. It
done.
looks
Yep.
like this is done. So hopefully we can, let me just close out of that and we'll just pop a new browser again. It's gonna log me in again. There we go, loaded up really fast that time. And now what we wanted to test was that we configured the routing correctly so that when I click on a route inside of a single page web application, it's now handled by the single page web application and not looking for a static file. So here
And I
we go.
think
Here's the
that
patient's
just
route.
worked. And if we click on that view patient, we should see like a patient detail, real simple patient
Yeah, that's
details
awesome.
example page. And that's all working. That's awesome. Great work.
All right. Well, cool. I think we did it. That's a few trials and tribulations there, but kind of the process of going through, if you just have a React single page web application, how you can get that spun up and hosted pretty simply in an Azure Static Web App.
That's great, Phil. Thanks so much for taking the time today to show this to me. And I think I've got a lot of questions and follow-up topics for this, but if we're going to do this as a weekly session, I think we've got plenty of time to do that.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Dave. See you next
Yep.
time.
See you next time. Thanks.
Bye.